Well, my mother was a big woman who just loved to cook and feed people. She was a nurturer. So my friends and I would come back from school and dump our books, and the first thing we knew, we were sitting down at the kitchen table, and she was making chocolate with the old batidor, Mexican chocolate, and everybody had this steaming, frothy chocolate. And there was always cookies and tacos. And I stay in touch with some of my friends that I grew up with. Some of them were all scattered all over, but they would always reminisce about my mother's cooking and the warmth in our house. My neighborhood was basically Italian, and we moved, well, 3 or 4 houses in that neighborhood. But I went to public school, and the kids from public school came from the other side of town, so there was a big mixture of immigrant families. Polish upstairs, we had an Irish family, and Russian. And so I grew up listening to all the different languages. Going into a friend's house was well, entering a new universe. You know, my Jewish friends, and I remember going into the house on Friday, and there was always newspapers on the floor, and mother yelling, "Don't bring the dirt in," you know. And of course, in Italian houses, the smells of pasta and well, one neighbor would grow grapes and make his own wine. And all this polyglot of impressions and tastes and smells is something I grew up with, and I'm very sensitive to that. My father was an amateur photographer. He set up a little studio in the living room, and he would photograph the neighbors when they had their confirmations or weddings. And in the bathroom, he set up a little dark room. And he would always ask me to come in, you know, the way I asked Pablo, come on in. And he would have me agitating the prints in the developer while he was setting up another print. And I swear I would never be a photographer because it was so boring in this dark room with this red light and the gurgling water, and all I'm doing is agitating. Never say never. So I became a photographer. Later, but only later in life, after I had a career as a designer. After working 10 years as an art director for various magazines, 17 and Esquire, then I went on to advertising because I wanted to do things in fashion, and working with terrific photographers. I just watched what they did, and finally I decided I just didn't want to go to another meeting, and I didn't want to just sit at a desk and be concerned about the politics of a structure, a corporation. So I gulped hard and came home one day, wrote a letter of resignation, and my wife opened up the door. We had 3 kids then. He says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, don't talk to me. I'm quitting my job." She closed the door. So I went in, turned in my letter of resignation, and everybody was kind of in awe of me, you know, so thinking, "You're crazy, but boy." And it worked. I started getting assignments from Vogue magazine because I had done a lot of pictures of my children, and that's what I showed. And they had a magazine called Vogue Children at the time, and I fit right in, and I started doing that. And then a friend of mine was Freddie Brenner, who was a men's fashion illustrator. We had worked at Esquire. His wife was Barbara Brenner, who wrote children's books. And we were having lunch one day at the house, and she said, "You know, I have an idea for a book, and I think photographs might be better than illustrations. It's called Faces." And she asked me, would I like to try it? I said, sure. So I tried it, and I designed the book also, and we presented it, and they loved it. So we did another book together called Bodies, and then after that, the editor said, "George, why don't you try writing a book?" I said, "Me, write? You know, I never went to college. I'm always a visual person." He said, "Well, you see, if you were to write the text, you would get the other 50% of the royalty." All right. So I wrote, and I did a book called Monsters on Wheels. They liked it, they published it, and voila, I'm an author. To photograph people and leave, I've never wanted to be a journalist because of that. You go in, you get your story, and you're out. I've had that feeling when I was doing the films for television, because you had to come in and they just need 30 seconds. And here I am in Tunisia, let's say, and I'm just getting to know people and seeing and discovering things, and only 30 seconds, you know, just not enough. And for me, for my experience, so that discovering children's books just opened up a lot of opportunities to get to know people, to be accepted by them, to live with them. And more than the book, I feel that it's enriched my life. I have friends, and I'm still in touch with children that I photographed very early in the, and I recently went back to a wedding of the little boy from Pablo Remembers. And I remember the father called me, collect, you know, and you know, it's Pablo's getting married. And he said, oh, well, I want to go. Yes, can you come? So I went, and it was so touching to walk into their house, and these kids who were, well, maybe like 6, 8, 10, 12 at the time, now are 21, 19, 17, look at me with this shock and come and just throw their arms around me and begin to cry. And I cry, you know, I get teary-eyed. And there's no substitute for that experience. Sure, I got a book, but I carry this in my heart all my life, and I'm a part of them, and they are part of me. And wherever I go, the same thing happens. So when I went to Mexico and I saw the way they spend the Day of the Dead, where the people get together like we do for Thanksgiving, and they spend a day and a night with their dead relatives in the cemetery. And they clean the gravestones, and they light candles, they put flowers, they put food offerings. And it's a time for prayer and contemplation, but also for enjoyment. The kids are running around playing, and people have guitars, and they'll be singing. And I came back and I thought, gee, I'd like to do something about that, about death is not something that you brush aside or you hide, but the Mexicans confront it, they mock it, they dance, and as an affirmation of life. So I came up with this proposal, and I started sending it out to publishers. And by that time, I was doing one book after another. It was fine. But I couldn't get this one published. Everybody was rejecting it. I got 13 rejections over a period of 5 years until Susan Pearson at Lothrop, Lee and Shepard looked at it, and he says, I'll publish it. When I was in high school, I would go on Saturdays to the Brooklyn Museum Art School, and I would take a drawing class. And I knew that Rufino Tamayo was teaching there, although I didn't take a class with him. One day I took my portfolio and showed it to him, and I said, you know, I am Mexican, but I've grown up here, and someday I'd like to go to Mexico. And he looked at my work, and he said, well, when you come, this is my address, come and see me. When I graduated. And I had saved $500 over the summers and from my work. And I took a Greyhound bus from New York to Mexico City. It took 5 days. So I arrived in Mexico City, and I got a little hotel someplace, and I went to see Rufino Tamayo, who was very cordial, and he wrote a note which allowed me to go to the Academia de San Carlos, which was the school where all the great painters went. And I took courses in fresco painting, the chemistry of painting, drawing, and sculpture. And I was able to stay there for about 3 or 4 months because my money was running out by then. And I had some relatives in Mexico City, but not much, and I knew I had to get to the Yucatan to meet my grandparents and my uncles, and that's where both families come from. So, but during that time in Mexico City, there were wonderful opportunities to meet people, that they really went out of their way to get students to have experiences at the theater, that danced there. I met Jose Limon and saw his performance. And one of those performances, I went backstage, and there was Diego Rivera and his wife, and he's a big man, and he looked down on me. I was introduced to him, and he said, "Oh, you must come to the house to have some mole." Well, he scared me. I didn't go. I grew up Mexican in a strange place. Aside from my parents, I had 2 uncles, and that's about it. And 2 cousins that lived in the Bronx who I would see occasionally. And they were growing up the same way as I, sort of Mexican-American. And when I went to Mexico for the first time and I met my Mexican cousins, and suddenly I was engulfed with family, you know, and it was so exciting. And I said to them, I've gotten to be, llegué a mi tierra, I've come to my country, to my land. And they looked at my shoes and they listened to my Spanish and said, you gringo. And I was crushed. But over the success of years of going back, I kind of relish who I am, because I have the best of both worlds.